is famously afraid of flying. Lovely.
I got good news.
And that's just a bit of what's news for now. I'm Nicole Sandler. If you appreciate these reports and the Nicole Sandler Show, I hope you'll consider making a contribution. My work is 100% listener supported, and I can't do it without your help. Find out more at NicoleSandler.com, and please click on that donate button.
The Leslie Marshall Show, a true democracy in talk radio. Of, for, and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Welcome to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm Brad Bannon, strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a commentator for news radio stations KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. BannonCR.com is the sponsor of today's show. If you want to learn more about me and my political polling company, or if you have any ideas or suggestions for Deadline DC, the best way to reach me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Brad Bannon, all one word. We've got a really big show for you today. Our guest in the first half hour is Atiba Madyun, who will discuss the impact of the pandemic on Black families. Then it's time for the provocative progressive political panel. My guest on the panel today, and we're going to discuss the climate meltdown in Texas, will be climate activist Tim Zenk and progressive activist Mark Grimaldi.
But let me just say this for those that continue to feign great surprise about what happened on January 6th. As a Black woman, to be barricaded in my office using office furniture and water bottles on the ground in the dark, that terror, those moments of terror, is familiar in a deep and ancestral way for me. And I want us to do everything to ensure that a breach like this never occurs at the Capitol, but I want us to address the evil and scourge that is white supremacy in this nation. This is not only about securing the Capitol to ensure that members and our staffs and the custodial staff and food service workers are safe in the Capitol. It is that we are safe in America. And one of the images that I'm haunted by is the Black custodial staff cleaning up the mess left by that violent white supremacist mob. That is a metaphor for America. We have been cleaning up after violent white supremacist mobs for generations, and it must end. So impeach, expel, investigate.
Our first guest today is Atiba Madyun. He's a political analyst, an author, and former deputy executive director of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Welcome to the show, Atiba. Thank you for joining us at Deadline DC today.
It's great to be here.
That clip was from Congresswoman Alanna Presley of Massachusetts talking about the Capitol coup or riot on January 6th. Let's start with that. She mentioned, and the House this week, the House of Representatives is beginning hearings today on what happened at the Capitol on that fateful and tragic day. Congresswoman Presley mentioned the fact that the riot was executed by white supremacists. What's your take? And, you know, I guess the other thing that's worthwhile talking about today, in the Senate, they're having confirmation hearings for Joe Biden's Attorney General nominee. Merrill Garland, and he talked about the Capitol riots. What does this say? What do the Capitol riots say about the rise and strength of white supremacy in this country?
Well, I think, well, first of all, thank you again for having me with you. And in terms of what we see right now that's going on, oftentimes we have a tendency to look forward and not look as much back. But I think we have to go back to 2008, 2009, when we saw the move that we saw the Tea Party, and the Tea Party was grounded and created out of racism, and it was in terms of racism toward a black president. Now we fast forward and we see what happened over the last 4 years of this president of the former president who built a lot of division and a lot of hate or brought that to the surface. So, what we're seeing in terms of these hearings, in terms of looking back, in terms of what happened on January 6th, I think that we really have to do a better job of talking and trying to look at the whole picture. Even further, looking at what is it, the root cause or whatever that's caused this hate and division. And as the Congresswoman said in the clip before, white supremacy, it's all of this is grounded in a past that's not very pleasant for people who look like myself.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Yeah, this is Black History Month, and what is this country making progress on racial relations, or is it going backward? I mean, we elected a black president, Barack Obama, for 2 terms. Then we got Donald Trump, who it seems to me, went out of his way to make racial tensions in this country worse than they ever were. Are we going forwards, or are we going backwards in race relations in this country?
You mentioned in your introduction today that your next panel, your political roundtable, is going to talk about climate. I remember President Obama, when he was in office, he talked about climate being our number one national security threat. I disagree with him then, and I'll say this: racism, fascism, sexism, xenophobia, all of that is our number one national security threat. Until we address that, until we talk about things, it's unfortunate that we're talking about a lot of these issues as it relates to race because of what happened with George Floyd last year. And then we saw something else happen with Breonna Taylor, and we saw Ahmaud Arbery. The country, in terms of progress, if you look at from our inception, it's always been about we make progress and then there's something that pulls us back because there's still a part of the society that either often feels that they're being left behind or that there's something that they're not getting, almost like a child in a big family who feels like one child is getting something that they're not getting. So this is it's a difficult thing to say that we have not made progress, which is why I think it's important for us to continue looking back in order to move forward. And we have to look back. If we look at where we were 50, 60 years ago, yes, we made a tremendous amount of progress. But if we look back to, for instance, 100 years ago, when I have a cousin who was lynched in North Carolina, because he spoke up, because there was a white young store employee who switched out his premium apples for a rotten batch of apples. And because he spoke up, a 150-member white mob came to the jail because they arrested him along with 14 other people, pulled him out of the jail, and killed him for speaking up. And that's what we have in this country. It seems like when we, as African Americans, tend to speak up about the atrocities and about the things that have happened, we end up being ostracized as if, why are you talking? You think it comes to mind LeBron James speaking up during the basketball season about what was going on with police brutality. So the country is moving forward. The problem is that there's still those that are part of the country that keep pulling us back.
Okay. Let me ask you about Joe Biden. You're wearing a shirt for our video viewers that says Kamala on it. How has Joe Biden and Kamala Harris addressed racial issues in this country in the first month of their presidency and vice presidency?
I think the president has done a number of things. When we start with his inauguration address, I mean, he spoke specifically about racism in his inauguration address. And then he started off and has signed several executive orders, one to try to repeal some of the things that came out of a racist administration before him. But we can't keep relying and thinking that all of this can be fixed because of we elect a black president or because now we have a first woman and first a person of color, African American and woman of Asian descent to be president of the vice president of the United States. That's not enough. We have to keep working. It's just like if you look at what happened in 2020 um, with the election in November, it was really great to see so many people and such a diverse coalition of voters come out and vote for this administration. But we've got to stay engaged in this process. It's not just about voting, it's about staying engaged and holding these elected officials accountable. So we can't expect the president is going to be able to do everything. We have to be working to make it easier for him to get us over the goalposts.
Okay, we're going to take a break now for our radio audience, but we will be continuing this interview with our TV audience. Our guest in this half hour is Atiba Madyun, who is an author, a political commentator, and former deputy director of the Black State Legislative Caucus. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC after these messages.
If you're worried your friend may be struggling, remember, you don't have to be there.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We are talking about Black History Month. Our guest is Atiba Madyun, who is an author and political commentator who's been kind enough to join us today on Deadline DC. Atiba, we observed the very tragic anniversary over the weekend. Right now, more than 500,000 Americans have died because of the pandemic. Many people have made the argument that as tragic as the pandemic has been, it has been multiplied. The impact of the pandemic has disproportionately hurt Black Americans. What has been the impact? We've got 500,000 Americans have died. How many has it disproportionately hurt African American residents of the United States?
Well, I think you have to look at African American, Hispanic Americans, who typically are right among our frontline workers. You know, working in hospitals, working in grocery stores, working on transportation, driving our buses. I think we really have to look at a lot deeper than just how COVID is impacting us, because for 20 years plus, I've been working on what people term is health disparities issues. We've got to look at how the healthcare system is. If we keep talking about the fact that systemic racism exists in America, systemic racism doesn't just exist in redlining when, in terms of us trying to get mortgages. It doesn't just exist in terms of us trying to get a job. It exists in our healthcare system. There are a lot of African Americans who are wary of getting a vaccine because of what happened with the Tuskegee experiment, when our lives were experimented with. So this is issue that I've been on several other shows to talk about health disparity and about COVID and how it's impacting the African American community. A lot of this is because of inequity in terms of money. The African Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to live in a multi-generational home, which means if there are a lot of people that are living in the home, it's harder to social distance. There are a lot of other issues in terms of when we go to the hospital and the doctor. There was even a story about an African American woman who was a doctor who had COVID, went to the doctor and went to the hospital, explained what they needed to do for her, and they wouldn't do it. And unfortunately, she died. This happens way too often within our communities. where we go to the doctor, we explain our symptoms, and we're sent back home. We don't receive the same type of care as our white counterparts. That's a serious part of the American system. And we started off by asking, have we made progress? We have not made the progress that we need to in this area.
Okay. We are going to take a break so we can get back to our radio audience. Our guest in this half hour is Atiba Madyun, who's a political commentator and an author who's here to talk about the impact of the pandemic economically and in terms of healthcare on African Americans. And we'll be back right after. Okay, welcome back to Brad, and welcome back to our radio audience. If you're in our radio audience, and if you're listening to us and you'd like to listen and watch us at the same time, there are a number of ways you can get the video feed of Deadline DC. You can go to periscope.tv at periscope.tv/Brad Bannon. We're also on Facebook Live at tinyurl.com /BB Facebook Live, and also on YouTube at tinyurl.com /Brad on YouTube. Our guest in this half hour is Atiba Madyun, who's a commentator and political analyst who's joining us here today to talk about the impact of the pandemic on African Americans. Let's try this. You know, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Atiba, is talk more about the economic impact that this pandemic has had on African Americans.
We're losing jobs. I mean, and it's unfortunate that a lot of African Americans who are either wage workers have lost their jobs because companies have cut, or a lot of small businesses have gone out of business in the last year. But there's also the effect in terms of how. I'm sorry, I'm taking a break because I kind of keep feeling like we keep talking about the issue in terms of how it's affecting African Americans. But I just want to stop and say from this standpoint, it's important for the stories and the things that have been happening to African Americans to be more humanized and not just put into another category and another data piece in terms of, well, this is what's happened to African Americans. Because the truth of it is African Americans are a part of the American culture. We have built this American economic system. We never benefit from it. We never get to benefit from it because we keep getting put in these different categories where we're not allowed to necessarily be part of the whole piece. So when you ask the question about how has it impacted the African American community, or how, it's not just jobs, it's also someone loses a job, and so someone else in the family tries to help somebody else in the family. But then if you make a certain amount of money, let's just say, for instance, if you make over $120,000, look at how that has impacted us in terms of stimulus payments or stimulus checks. So this whole thing is not just about how it's been impacting African Americans. I think it's also how it's impacting other Americans. It's just that it keeps having this flashlight, this spotlight on terms of African Americans. And it really goes into a whole lot of other areas that we don't really even have time to really go into in this amount of time. But it's real. And but we just saw what happened in Texas with the snowstorm and how people were affected with power. Well, imagine that in a global sense in terms of the whole country, in terms of African Americans, in terms of how we have felt in terms of this whole piece of this. And so it's just so much deeper. And for me, not to say that I didn't want you to ask me that question, it hurts because the virus is not the only thing that keeps impacting us. It's the virus of racism that keeps impacting us too.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. This week, the House of Representatives is going to be debating Joe Biden's pandemic, the American Rescue Plan, which would include aid to state and local governments, and a number of other things. What do you think the House and Senate should be mindful of when they debate the president's rescue relief package?
If you look at a state like Georgia, where we just saw Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff win. I think that they won the elections there because there are a lot of people that are hurting. And there are a lot of people who are tired of the country and politicians politicizing their pain. So what should they be looking at? We know the president is going to look at small businesses. He talked about that today. Hopefully it's going to be narrowed down even more in terms of minority and in terms of incorporating African American and women. But I would love to see, in terms of this package, do something not just to help to save businesses, but really to help to save people and people who own these businesses. It shouldn't, $1.9 trillion is still not enough. And when we look at where we started at this March 14th, I know in DC, where we first went into quarantine, to where we are coming into almost March 14th a year later. And we look at the transfer of wealth that has occurred over this period of time, that's very serious. And that's not just African Americans who've been impacted. That's this whole country. That's the middle class, which the president talked about today. The middle class is our engine. And yet the middle class keeps getting penalized for being the engine of this country. So I'm hoping and I'm hopeful that both Democrats and Republicans will look in terms of the pain that Americans are feeling as a result of this. The unfortunate part about this is that we know that in the political culture that we have, there's going to be a lot of political or conversation about this, and one side that's not going to do anything because it wants to make it more difficult for the other side. And this really is not a political issue. It shouldn't be. It should be an American. How are we going to save American people, their lives, their homes? So many people are struggling right now to pay mortgages and rents. So those are the type of things that I would like to see really get addressed in this package.
Okay. I'd like to ask you a question. The House also is the Senate's having hearings, and actually both houses are having hearings this week that have to do with the attempted Capitol coup on January 6th. One of the things that has bothered me is it seems to me in many cases the criminal justice system has treated many of the rioters pretty casually. For instance, one of them who was jailed for her partner Ryan, the riot asked a judge if she could go on a planned vacation, and I guess the judge allowed her to. And then there's Kyle Rittenhouse, who is accused of murdering two people, who basically jumped bail, and the last I checked, the police haven't been able to find him. And if you compare that with some of the treatment that the criminal justice system has exacted on African Americans, like George Floyd, for example, it seems to me there's the glaring contrast between the treatment of white supremacists and people who may have been demonstrated or protested at Black Lives Matter rallies.
So I'm sorry. What was the question?
Well, the question is, do you think that the criminal justice system treats white people differently than Black people?
I almost want to pause and say, it does. Yeah, of course. It has always discriminated against African Americans, and so we know that there is a difference. We know it's a difference when we saw what happened. I mean, to watch an insurrection play out on television, to watch those people go into the United States Capitol, and then to look back after George Floyd was killed and then think about the protests that happened for social justice because of the killing of George Floyd, and to see remember that the pepper spray that was sprayed because
Atiba, thank you very much. And sadly, we've reached a half hour and we're out of time. Want to thank you very much. Our guest was Atiba Madyun, a political commentator and author. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this?
Okay, thank you very much.
Where does sand come from?
Thank you. Nah, it's okay.
Is this tree good for climbing?
All right, take care.
What happens if I mix these two things together? How were babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Wake up and text. Text and eat. Text and catch the bus. Text and miss your stop. Wait. Text and be late to work.
Sorry, I'm late.
Text and work. Text and pretend to work. Text and act surprised when someone calls you out for not working.
Who, me?
Text and meet up with a friend you haven't seen in forever.
Hi. Oh, hey.
Text and complain that they're on their phone the whole time. Text and listen to them complain that you're on your phone the whole time. Text and whatever. But when you get behind the wheel, give your phone to a passenger. Put it in the glove box. Just don't text and drive. Visit Stop Texts, Stop Wrecks.
Many Americans can't believe that political coups are part of our country's history. But consider the Wall Street Putsch of 1933. Never heard of it? It was a corporate conspiracy to oust Franklin Roosevelt, who had just been elected president. With the Great Depression raging and millions of families financially devastated, FDR had launched several economic recovery programs to help people get back on their feet. To pay for this crucial effort, he had the audacity to raise taxes on the wealthy, and this enraged a group of Wall Street multimillionaires. Wailing that their, quote, liberty to grab as much wealth as possible was being shackled, they accused the president of mounting a class war. To pull off their coup, they plotted to enlist a private military force made up of destitute World War I veterans who were upset at not receiving promised federal bonus payments. One of the multimillionaire's lackeys reached out to a well-respected advocate for veterans, retired Marine General Smedley Darlington Butler. They wanted him to lead 500,000 veterans in a march on Washington to force FDR from the White House. But they chose the wrong general. Butler was a patriot and lifelong soldier for democracy who in his later years was critical of corporate war profiteering, and he was repulsed by the hubris and treachery of these Wall Street aristocrats. He reached out to a reporter, and together they gathered proof to take to Congress. A special congressional committee investigated and found Butler's story, quote, alarmingly true, leading to public hearings with Smedley Darlington Butler giving detailed testimony. This is Jim Hightower saying, by exposing the traitors, this courageous patriot nipped their coup d'etat in the bud. But their sense of entitlement reveals that we must beware of the concentrated wealth of the imperious rich, for it poses an ever-present danger to your and my majority rule.
Welcome back to Deadline. I'm Brad Van. In this half hour, we're going to talk about the mess and energy mess in Texas, climate change, and the climate crisis. But before that, last week there was good news and bad news on the climate front. The good news was that President Biden reinstated the United States as a member in good standing with the rest of the world in the Paris Environmental Accords. The bad news was very bad. The energy crisis in Texas exposed the ugly realities of climate change. People died of exposure while the Republican governor of Texas lied when he said that the Green New Deal was responsible for the power outages. The weather in Texas was frightful, but in Cancun it was warm and delightful. In the middle of the devastating climate crisis, Senator Ted Cruz traveled to sunny Cancun, which dramatized his indifference to his constituents and to the climate threat that challenges the health, wealth, and well-being of all Americans. You can read my take on policy and politics every week in the Hill. Just Google muckrack.com/Brad-Bannon. Brad-Bannon.
What we saw in Texas certainly shows what folly the Green New Deal would be, how unreliable wind and solar power generation really is, and how it needs fossil fuel backup. We've also learned how vulnerable our grid is to, again, the unreliable green energy, but also potentially to geomagnetic disturbance from the sun, solar winds, and also potentially EMP attacks.
Yep. The first inclination of the Texas Republicans, including the governor, was to blame the energy crisis caused last week by the bad weather on the Green New Deal and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which brings us today's provocative progressive political panel. Our guest panelist today is Tim Zenk. Tim Zenk is a principal at Molecule, a public affairs and business company. Tim has spent his distinguished career shaping public policy, especially in the area of energy and climate. His Twitter handle is @GreenCrude. Joining Tim on the panel is progressive political activist Mark Grimaldi. Mark has worked on get out the vote operations for Democratic presidential candidates, including Joe Biden. Mark also fights for campaign finance reform and funding for cancer research. His Twitter handle is Mark J. Grimaldi. Okay, panel, welcome. Tim, let's start with you. As I mentioned, President Biden rejoined the Paris Environmental Accords last week after Donald Trump had walked out on them, and I think on the first day of his presidency a little more than 4 years ago. What does the fact that the United States is again part of the worldwide climate accords, what does that mean?
It means the United States is part of the leadership role of countries that are necessary to bring the rest of the nation and the world along to reduce the impacts of climate. And it's an important organization for us to lead in and really drive the agenda and helping nations bigger and smaller than us reduce the carbon intensity of everything that they're doing, to eliminate fossil fuels from their transportation networks, to reducing the impact of those fossil fuels on all the issues that we've been addressing, here today, related to ultra extreme temperatures, from heat to cold to snow to weather. Those impacts are going to be with us for decades to come, and that's what it's all about.
Okay, Mark, what do you think so far of the initiatives that Joe Biden has taken to fight climate change?
I mean, I think in the limited amount of time he's done the most important step, which was an obvious one, to be fair, but and most important, which was to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. That was, let's not take anything away from that. That was a massive step to get all of the countries that it did involved, and unfortunately, and a huge black eye for us as Americans, Donald Trump pulled us out of the climate accord despite its overwhelming popularity with Americans, and regardless of that, how important it is in the world that we are a part of that, and to get other countries to come along and follow their promises, we need to be doing ours. So I think that was a huge step, and you also see the work that Transportation Secretary Buttigieg is starting to layout that he's going to do with making our fleet that we use in the United States green, and also a huge step, which we're going to be hearing more about in the coming weeks, is the president's infrastructure plan. It is, almost like an infrastructure / environment plan, because it's going to have so much to do with renewable energy. So I'm really excited for that, to hear about that. And I know Tim probably is as well, because I know he's very passionate about climate change as well. So I think this is a huge opportunity for us to advance, this issue.
Okay, Tim. What exactly happened in Texas last week? Texas has its own power grid. The Governor Abbott's first explanation of what happened is that the environmentalists caused it by demanding, wind turbines and all sorts of renewable energy. But that was a ridiculous excuse. But what did happen in Texas last week?
It's the colliding. We're colliding with the future of extremes, and essentially, it's kind of shocking that the governor of the largest energy state in the world wouldn't understand that the power system and the grid needs to be balanced. Meaning, if there's too much demand and not enough supply, the entire grid crumbles. And it's called a grid for a reason, meaning everything has to be balanced. And what happened is that there was more demand because of cold temperatures and the inability of the state to provide funding to harden those systems in cold temperatures. The same happens in extreme high temperatures. In fact, Texas experienced this about 5 years ago in extreme high temperature conditions, where their grid partially collapsed. This is not the first time Texas has dealt with this problem. They are obsessed with being independent from the federal national grid because they fear federal regulations which require hardening of systems for cold or hot temperatures. Imagine that. It's essentially the lowest common denominator. The lowest price is what wins. It's not about making sure people have access to water and sewer and electricity at all times, 24 hours a day. When you flip the switch, it should work. It wasn't about that. It was about profits for big corporations. It was about poor management. And it was about really horrible political leadership on the part of the Republicans, and particularly on the part of the governor in the state of Texas. They knew damn well enough what was going to happen at some point, and they were just hoping to point the finger at Democrats.
Okay, I read somewhere, Tim, that renewable energy only accounts for, I think, 10% of the power generated in Texas, which is one of the reasons why the governor's take on the situation sounded patently ridiculous. Do you think the Americans will buy the governor's explanation, or this will contribute to a rising awareness of the problems of climate change?
I think it will do both. Well, first of all, you're right about the statistic in terms of the amount of renewable power in the state of Texas. That's a remarkable number, actually. If you think about 10% of the electric grid in Texas being renewable over the last 20 years have been accomplished, that's a pretty big accomplishment. But hard power, like natural gas and nuke and other sources, are what is relied upon, firm power, because it's always available, versus intermediate power of renewables that exist. And it's all about the interplay of those systems and how they work together. And will it send a message about the impacts of climate change? Brad, you and I have done a lot of survey work around the country, and we're seeing these trends occur throughout the country. We're seeing trends where people actually are deeply concerned with the impacts of climate change. And I just think this reinforces in people's minds what can happen. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. We haven't even really gotten to 450 parts per million. We're still hovering around 417 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Imagine when we actually reach the tipping point a few years from now.
Okay. We're going to go to break now, but when we come back, we'll have more of the provocative progressive political panel.
America, your children have an amazing superpower. They can help save lives by not having play dates. That's right. By replacing get-togethers with virtual play dates and video chats, they can help slow the evil spread of germs. And if your superheroes do go outside,
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, and I'm Brad Bannon. We are in the middle of the provocative progressive political panel, and we've been talking about the energy mess in Texas and climate change. Our guest in this half hour is Tim Zenk, who has spent a good part of his career trying to bring America kicking and screaming into the era of renewable energy. Also on the panel today is progressive activist Mark Grimaldi. Tim, there are various efforts around the country focused on dealing with climate change and championing renewable energy. Tell us about the project that you and we're working on together in Washington State. Tell us about Governor Inslee's environmental agenda.
Yeah, so Governor Inslee has, as you might imagine, a pretty aggressive environmental agenda. The legislature passed a 100% clean electricity bill a year ago. They've moved on to transportation fuels in this session. And transportation fuels are all about low carbon fuel standards. The state of California and the government of Oregon and also the British Columbia have all instituted, as well as European nations, these low carbon fuel standards which reduce the carbon intensity, how much carbon is in fuel on a life cycle basis, and it does that over a period of time. So we're working in that area to this year, working on the reduction of the carbon intensity of fuels through low carbon fuel standards, the impacts on buildings for heating, and the reductions of carbon intensity of those facilities. And then they're also working on another couple of initiatives, cap and trade, which is an economy-wide carbon reduction standard. So a lot going on out here in Washington, as you know.
Yeah, okay. Certainly hope Governor Inslee is successful on that. Let's try this. What would you recommend to the folks in Texas on how to rebuild their energy system?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about energy, in particular electrification, is all about a diversity of supply, and diversity of supply provides, the opportunity for you to protect against catastrophic failures, right? And that's what just occurred. So, while they do have some diversity of supply in the state of Texas, it's heavily set on the use of real inexpensive gas, and with some backup with nuke facilities. But again, the whole concept would be to improve the diversity of supply by bringing on renewable or green sources of electrification.
And we certainly hope that they do that, although they're going to a lot of urging. Okay, we're going to go to break now. Okay. We come back from our break. We'll have more with the provocative progressive political panel with energy activist Tim Zenk and also progressive activist Mark Grimaldi. We'll be back. More at the link.
Hey, Brad, good to go.
Welcome back to Deadline DC. Brad Bannon. This is the provocative progressive political panel. Our guests are a clean energy activist Tim Zenk and progressive activist Mark Grimaldi. Let's try this. Joe Biden is mounting what I would describe as a mammoth effort to build back America after the economic slowdown caused by the pandemic. The first stage is a $1.9 trillion package, which would contain cash grants for Americans, aid to states and local governments in fighting the pandemic, and all sorts of things. If that passes, and I think it probably will in some form, then there's the next step, and that would be a massive infrastructure bill. And from what what I've seen and heard, it could be a larger package as $3 trillion. And that would include money for a massive investment in our infrastructure with a focus on clean energy, which is badly needed. My question is, that's probably, that kind of package, we're talking about $3 trillion, which is much bigger than the America Rescue Plan, is going to require heavy lifting. It will run into opposition from Republicans in the Senate who are climate change deniers, such as Senator Cruz. It will also probably run into opposition for Republicans for the massive expense. They didn't care about spending money like crazy while Donald Trump was president, but now that we have a Democratic president, they're born again fiscal conservatives. So, Mark, what do you think that Joe Biden needs to do to pass his infrastructure package, which again, I think is going to be a really heavy lift for him because he'll need 60 votes in the Senate to break a filibuster?
I think that it presents a good opportunity. It is going to be hard if Mitch McConnell, locks down his caucus because of what you highlighted. But I think that there is some interest on the Republican side, as documented by the comments of those who supported it during the Trump administration. So, I would key in on that. I would start from the process of, come in with what you're looking for and, see what kind of agreement you can come up with and see if it's palatable. It may not be exactly, it won't be exactly what we look at from the start, but I think that it's going to be a good opportunity to help these people in their districts. That's the thing. They're going to want to be able to, if they can deliver, some of these senators deliver critical infrastructure improvements to our country at a time when, I think it was something like 3 or 4 years ago, we were already graded a D plus from the Army Corps of Engineers for our country's infrastructure. It's only gotten worse. So this is an opportunity for them to come back to their district and say, look what I delivered for you. It's creating jobs. It's improving the infrastructure of our district. So I think that's the key that he's going to have to push forward, what's in it for them, and do the best you can to keep as many of the renewable energy policies in it as you can from the start. That's the way I would see it being able to move forward.
Okay. Tim, it seems to me that if Joe Biden is going to get the Senate to pass his infrastructure and clean energy package sometime in the next couple of months, he's going to have to go around the Senate and make his case to the American public. How should Joe Biden make his case to the American public about the need for infrastructure reconstruction and also the dangers of climate change, which I think will go together? And I guess one argument he can point to in terms of infrastructure is what happened in Texas last week. But what argument does Joe Biden have to make to the American people about the need for infrastructure and clean energy?
Well, first, it's all about jobs in the economy, and can't forget that. There's a very persuasive political argument, so I would focus on the impacts of jobs created through an infrastructure package. The second thing I would do is remind everybody what happens when we don't prepare properly. for crisis, for events that we know are going to happen, i.e. COVID, i.e. the most recent disaster in Texas. And we have to get ahead of this in order for our economy to grow and maintain our preeminent role in the world against China, who are building infrastructure like crazy. 40 new hospitals are under development in China, just alone. So we got to get after it, man. And I think he's just got to make a persuasive argument and build coalitions. And it has to be of national interest for us to be successful and for him to get the cloture votes he needs.
Okay. Mark, you want to weigh in on that? Well, let me ask you a different question, Mark. Mm-hmm. Right now, Joe Biden is enjoying sort of a honeymoon. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons why he is. But last week, I checked the 538 website, and their national average for Biden's approval was 56 positive and 38% negative, which in this age of divisive politics, I think is actually pretty good. Donald Trump never had a plus job rating during his whole presidency, and Joe Biden has a net approval of 18% now, which I think, considering the circumstances and what he inherited, is a godsend. First of all, why do you think what has Joe Biden done or said so far that has got the approval of Americans?
He's solving problems, and he's doing it without making it about himself. That's what his presidency has been about. It's been about action. One thing that stuck with me was I read about how he and those coming in with his administration had studied what FDR did his first 100 days, and then they tried to condense that amount of action into his first week. And you just see the flurry of activity that they are doing within their power. And, they are meeting the moment. They are taking this crisis head on, these many crises head on, whether it be COVID, whether it be the environment, whether it be the economy, whether it be racial inequality. They've done something to address each of them. They figured out, what power do I have right now? And what can I do about it right now? And how do I attack the problem going forward? And I think that's what the American people have been hungry for. They've sat around long enough and watched a president under Donald Trump not only do not the right thing or just have inaction, but do the wrong thing. Go out in public and not wear a mask, and go out and ignore the crises. Just mishandle the funds that were supposed to be used for COVID. They were going to have spend something like $300 million on an ad campaign about how they were defeating the crisis. An interview just came out yesterday with Dr. Fauci talking about how Trump vindictively, quote, let terrible things happen in response to Dr. Fauci disagreeing with him in public about COVID. So I think Joe Biden has been the opposite of that, which the American people, some, would have voted for Donald Trump, are in that approval. And I think that speaks to the fact that he's been able to win them over with his actions, and all the scary things that Donald Trump said about Joe Biden. People are just seeing that those aren't true. And now the proof's in the pudding. They can see it right in front of them. And he's appropriately acknowledging the magnitude of the crisis. The flags will be flying at half staff later today for the 500,000 Americans who have lost their lives due to COVID. You have to recognize what the crisis is before you can defeat it. And I think that's also important as well.
Okay. I think part of it, I think Joe Biden has done a lot in a month. I also think just many Americans are just relieved that Donald Trump is gone. I think what Biden did in dealing with this Texas mess was very illustrative. He basically, they voted for, they're very conservative. All the conservative Republicans call the shots, but he jumped on aid to Texas in the result of, in the midst of the crisis they face. Anyway, that's it for Deadline DC today. I want to thank my guest, Atiba Madyun. Tim Zenk, and Mark Grimaldi. This is Brad Bannon. Stay strong, stay safe, and stay sane if you can while the pandemic rages. I'll be back next Monday, same bat time, same bat channel. Leslie Marshall will be back tomorrow, so make sure you listen, or there will be big trouble. Anyway, I'll see you next Monday.
Thanks, Brad.